And so we're going to go ahead and start tonight. This is not necessarily a formal conversation. It's an important and critical conversation. It's a conversation that is essential, I think, and necessary in light of where we are in our world. And I want to start this way as I was thinking about everything and reflecting back to the night before my father's life was tragically taken away from him through an assassin's bullet. There were many important things he said that night, but I want to lift perhaps one of the things that he said that night that is apropos to this moment that we're in now, all across the world. In light of the subject we're talking about is our right, keyword right, to protest in jeopardy. He said that night that the greatness of America is the right to protest for right.
But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest for right.
Because so often as protests are taking place around the world and people are demonstrating their passion and commitment to social justice, my father's name is invoked some kind of way, either by those that are protesting, those that are in the media, those who are misinterpreting, and what's the other word I'm looking for? Those who are hijacking the narratives,
making up stuff.
Making all kind of stuff up. So we're going to talk about that tonight. So where do you want to start, Dr. West? You want to start with what is protest? You know, we talk about that a lot.
Absolutely. I pulled up,
and particularly we can look at it overall, but we want to set the stage tonight to just say this: we are talking from the perspective of Kingian nonviolence, because the movement that many people have drawn their thoughts about, guidance from perhaps, is the movement that my father led, the nonviolent movement. And so as you're listening tonight, keep that in mind. We are coming, and we're going to talk about Kingian, what Kingian really is, but Kingian being Dr. King's philosophy and methodology, understanding and approach to protest and the right to protest and things of that nature. So you were getting ready to say, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I apologize.
Oh, it's okay. No, I pulled up because I wanted to read, just for all of our hearing, the First Amendment and some explanation of what it means. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. And there's an explanation of a case here that goes on to say the right of the people peaceably to assemble for the purpose of petitioning Congress for a redress of grievances or for anything else connected with the powers or duties of the national government is an attribute of national citizenship, and as such under protection of and guaranteed by the United States. So just to give from our own document, our guiding document, our Constitution, this First Amendment to peaceably assemble, and I think, Dr. King, to your point, to protest for, to assemble for, petitioning for redress of grievances or shift in policy. Will be a further explanation of that. I think it's very important to understand what you said earlier. What are we petitioning, protesting for? And I was thinking about, as we were talking about this earlier, King, how there was a march on Washington for jobs and freedom, a march for voting rights, a march for, and I'm wondering about the power of, as we start the conversation and talk about protesting for something versus highlighting primarily what we're against. What's the power of the for?
But before we get to that, I just want to point this out. Right now, our humanity is in jeopardy. With the triple evils that my father called poverty, racism, and militarism. And when we look at what's happening in Gaza, in the Congo, in Sudan, and the voices and people that are rising up all around this world to protest what they feel is a threat to our humanity, a threat to the dignity of people to live. I would call it the freedom to peacefully coexist in their nations and even within our nation, the freedom to participate in government and the freedom to prosper in life. All of that is being threatened all around the world. And we thank God that we have and live in a nation, and there are people across this world that live in nations where the right to protest is real. In our country, it's constitutionalized. We have a right peacefully to demonstrate, to protest our grievance against those things that we feel violate human life, that threaten human life. And so I want to say that as we look at what's happening across this nation currently on college campuses with many of these young people, I'm going to dare to say something that, although there are many ways of looking at what's happening today, the one thing that I do want to say is I think that as with any period of time, there are always voices from younger generations that have a tendency to ignite things in a nation. And when I say ignite, I'm not talking about anything violent. I'm talking about seeking to prick the conscience. It happened in Vietnam. It happened during the movement that my father led. And I think there is a rallying cry right now for people to say, look, people's human lives are in jeopardy, all lives. And let's talk about that, because you did a piece recently talking about there's no indispensable life. I think that was the
expendable.
Expendable life. No life in this world is expendable. No Palestinian, no Israeli life is inexpendable. There's no life in the Congo, any part of Africa, China, Europe, North and South America, in Australia and New Zealand and all across this world.
Anywhere.
So we want to establish that starting out, because what is happening right now is very troubling and disturbing, to say the least. And so let's just dive in about, before we get to four, what is protest? What is protest?
No, I think that is what you just shared is a for, and it leads us into this question of what is protest, and in particular for us, the right to peaceably assemble, and getting us to a place where we understand what that can look like in a strategic way, but also some of the things that would come against that. And based on the First Amendment here, when your father talked about the right to protest for right, he said, somewhere I read, and he's referring to the First Amendment, that we could protest, we could assemble to express our grievances and to say there needs to be a change. And so I believe that's the simple definition for protest: a peaceful assembly to express adamantly, passionately, that something must change for the good of humanity. That's what Dr. King was talking about when he's talking about protest. And I think also what the Constitution is referring to. We can say to our Congress, to our government, to leaders now, even now to our corporate leaders, there must be a shift in what we're seeing in these inhumane situations across the globe, not leaving out the United States and the things that we see here that absolutely demand our voices and our action, our negotiation.
And let me just say this: as we know, this world is very interconnected.
Mm-hmm.
So what's happening right now in many places concerns all of us. We have a responsibility to humanity. And so when we see people exercising this right to protest concerning things happening within their country and outside of their country that's connected to their country, because we are all interconnected in humanity, we need to not critique that, because people have a right, if there's a grievance, especially if your nation is interconnected and doing, with other nations. Part of the goal, not the only thing, but part of the goal is to win over allies, not to just restrict yourself to those within the confines of your geography, but to win more and more people to the cause. And so people are going to come. Viola Luiso came from Detroit to be a part of the Selma to Montgomery campaign.
I think that's why it's important, though, Dr. King, as we talk about Kingian nonviolent protests, to establish a strategy, because there will be either people who infiltrate by ignorance or purposefully people who infiltrate to try to stop the progress of a movement or a campaign. And so, but if you have strategy, love-centered strategy, which Kingian nonviolence is, you can deal with those things. And then there will be people who will say to those even who are peaceably protesting and assembling, you're an outside agitator, to which your father responded in a letter from Birmingham jail, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And this favorite quote that you love, we're caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. But we do have to keep in mind that strategy helps us to deal with folks who will try to come in and with their actions could deter focus from our goal that we're trying to reach in protest.
But I also think it's important because, I had an opportunity to see what's happening. Emory is one of my alma mater.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why one of the other reasons I wanted to say something tonight. I've been wanting to say something a long time. But as my alma mater, I heard this outside language. I wanted to address it because I've heard it in other places. I heard it when some other things were going on here in the city. I've heard it over and over again. And there's just this propagandizement around outsiders as a means, to almost quail the legitimacy of people who are doing it the right way, who are protesting peacefully. And so I wanted to address it because the other factor is, as a part of strategy in a movement, is helping people, is ensuring that there are messengers. My father was a spokesperson. It doesn't have to be a spokesperson, but there does have to be a unified message so that people can hear loudly your message. And in the case of Emory and in some other cases, the majority of people have not been outsiders.
Right.
And that's why that's why strategy is important, because you have to know that. You have to recognize and start out, okay, if we want to make sure that our voices are heard, that our messages are clear, that the demands that we have are clear, and that's a whole nother issue that, a lot of this requires some training and education that, we do through the King Center. this ain't about those police officers. This is about the greater issue, you know. And so you don't want to make that the battleground.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? And so that's why this strategy that nonviolence helps with. People think nonviolence is just about if somebody hits me, I don't hit them back. It is about that, but that's not solely what it's about. It's about fighting for justice and advancing justice, advancing humanity. And when you have your mind focused on that ultimate goal, then not even that law enforcement officer should pull you off of that and cause you to get on their, agenda and become like we say, when you're fighting for justice, you don't want to become unjust yourself.
Unjust. But
exactly.
Doesn't that 4 help that? Isn't that why?
Exactly. Daddy said the right to protest for right, and we should just clear it up for me, protest for, not against, right. And what I've seen, I can't speak for everybody who's there. I can't speak for anybody who's been protesting, around what's happening in Gaza and for the Palestinian people. But what I can say is, when I voice my opinion is about for. When I'm protesting, I'm protesting for something. I'm not protesting against. And so
the question would become, why can't we be for humanity living? And what would that look like to have what your father called true peace, where we have justice, and it's not just an absence of tension, but we work towards there not being these outbreaks of violence that were happening even before October 7th. There were Israeli people, Palestinian people. There were people getting put out of their homes in the West Bank. Palestinian people getting put out of their homes by Israeli forces. There's just been decades of, some people will say millennial, based on biblical context of violence and conflict. But what do we do now? What are we for? What type of, personal commitment is one of the steps of nonviolence? What you've been talking about and what we've been sharing about, I think a large part of it is that personal commitment. But to what? If you talk about how to be strategically engaged in protest in a way that has an ultimate goal and that says, I'm not going to let anything distract me from working for this ceasefire. I'm not going to let anything distract me from working for true peace, from stopping the annihilation of my neighbors in Gaza.
Let me just say this. I want what's happening in Gaza to stop right now. Beyond the ceasefire, I want it to stop. The killing, the animosity, the hate, hostility, and we know that's not going to happen tomorrow.
Correct.
We know it's not going to happen. And that's why we have this right to protest for right. That's why we have, nonviolence as a strategy. You create the proper tension to put moral persuasion where it needs to be in those who make critical decisions, who may be undergirding what's happening in Israel. So I want all of that to stop. So I just need to say that while you were making that point.
And people even raising the question, why is this war getting so much attention when we know what's happening in Sudan? We know what's happening in Congo. One of the reasons I think is because, one, those are African nations. Let's just be honest. Right. And so often we don't talk about what's happening on the continent of Africa for reasons, like racism, like there being a notion that violence is just a given on the continent, but also there's the funding that United States funds are being used to buy the weapons to keep this war going. And that's a major concern, that one of the things people are protesting for is divestment, similar to, I believe, what happened with South Africa. And maybe there are some things to look at there that made that a success in getting to that goal.
Yeah, I think that has to be studied. Here. Yeah, I think that needs to be studied, because we just can't haphazardly call for that, because again, You know, the messaging has to be clear, the strategy has to be clear, the plan has to be clear, and it has to, you want as many, you know, I call this allies because that's the language you use, and that's a whole nother discussion for me, but you want as many people allied with you in the movement that you are leading, and so, you know, we have to always keep that in mind. It's bigger than the quote unquote enemy, you know, or the target. It's you got to keep that in mind, because the target may throw you off. You know, they may keep you, you know, in this tension and in this conflict and in this violence. But there are other people out there, you know, and you want to gain, you know, a critical mass of people who can now prick the conscience and put the pressure where it needs to be put on the people who can make a decision in what is happening. And so there's just so many things, you know, related to what's going on right now. And I just want to talk about what's troubling to me all the time, which I think is what this is really about tonight. Is right to protest for right, or is our right to protest in jeopardy? You know, jeopardy maybe, you know, because we have so many efforts around this nation through legislation and through
threats of funding just popped up. Yeah, that they're threatening funding for colleges that continue to allow
colleges.
protest.
You know, there are all kinds of things that are happening to threaten this right to protest, to shut it down, to suppress it, because, you know, the agenda, whatever the agenda is, and I'm concerned about that. I'm concerned that authentic and genuine peaceful protests are being shut down, and that, you know, people, more importantly, as they are protesting, are being treated in a way that they don't have to be treated. Right. I mean, there is a right response even from law enforcement, you know, in peaceful protest. There is a way to humanely arrest people, you know, and oftentimes, almost all the time, there have been times that it's become militaristic. You know, what I saw, at least what I saw on the campus of Emory, and this is, I only had the viewpoint of, you know, a few people I talked to, but what I saw that the news media highlighted, I could not understand the kind of force that was used. You know, for people. There is a way to deal as a law enforcement officer, and that's why we do training with law enforcement, to humanely arrest people who may be wiggling or whatever you want to call it, when you know, or you call it resisting arrest. There's a way to do it, and for them to still have dignity, and you will have, it doesn't take away from their dignity to do that. And so there is a right way to also respond to the right to protest.
Correct. From institutions and law enforcement.
Institutions and law enforcement, you know. And so there's just golly, there's just so much stuff that's very troubling, because I'm thinking about the disproportionate show of force, you know. Because if I'm in law enforcement, I have most of the artillery, you know, I have most of the power. So power is not matched here. So there's no need for me to overextend my power. I mean, really. And there's no need for me to broad stroke, and the highlight and the focus becomes those outsiders. It was violent. What about the peaceful part? How come we didn't highlight the peaceful part of the protest? We like to take, if there's one or two, and I'm not saying there was, but if there's one or two or three or whatever, and that becomes the major issue and gets it off focus. And that's why we're coming back to why strategy
is
and
important.
planning
A
is
messaging.
important, and
A
messaging.
Yeah, and they're gonna there'll be an escalation of rhetoric anyway. Even when your father protested and led direct action campaigns in Birmingham, there was a cartoon that said he was violent, and he was nonviolent without the hyphen, meaning that he believed his whole posture, even his communication, which is something that we have to get about Kingian nonviolence. If you say you're following the pattern of Dr. King, that means you don't call police pigs, you don't write it on your shoes, you don't insult people when you're out protesting, because your whole posture is, I am a vessel for nonviolence and I want social change, but I'm not willing to be hateful to get to it, because I can't get to driving out hate with hate. And so it's this whole way of thinking that we believe, if you embrace it and you get with the 6 principles and the 6 steps of Kingian nonviolence, even that question about what do you do when people are threatening funding for your university, you could have a negotiation, nonviolent negotiation, and a pathway to addressing that. That's just about, no, let us sit down and talk to the people who are threatening to do that. And if negotiation doesn't work, that's the 4th step. Then I go to direct action. Direct action is the 5th step in Kingian nonviolence. And when I get there, that's me saying negotiation didn't work. And now if they're threatening our funding, let us discover a path that puts pressure on them without dehumanizing them to not do that. But Kingian nonviolence helps with all of that.
It does. And the thing is that it all goes together. These steps aren't sequential necessarily. Because just because the direct action or protesting is going on does not mean that there's not a cadre of people who are also working on the inside to speak to the issue. But what I'm seeing now today, there seems to be a disconnect between the people who are protesting, and people who may just, because they're concerned about what's going on, who may be talking behind the scenes. That's why the strategy is important, because the several things work together for the ultimate goal that we are trying to achieve. And I wanted to say this too, when we're talking about protesting, when Dad our protesters the right to protest, and in his teachings, one of the steps of nonviolence is about personal commitment. They used to call it purification. That means you have to be prepared when you are protesting. One of the things you have to be prepared for is keeping that holistic nonviolent posture, which you were just talking about, in your language, in your behavior, in your actions, in your spirit. You want to rid yourself even of bitterness, because if that bitterness is there, it's going to show up somewhere. You got to believe that you're not just freeing, whatever the issue is, but you're freeing everybody in this. You're freeing the perpetrator, that they're hostage to some force of, unjust or some evil force, and they're perpetuating something that they even need to be freed from. And so you have to be prepared to maintain that posture so that when you go into it, where the injustice lies can clearly be seen. What the message is and what you're trying to get to in the end can clearly be understood. And more importantly, you have to be prepared to be disciplined enough to understand that what comes with stepping out there in that vein is sacrifice. So you have to be willing to suffer for this just cause, for the greater good. That means when Daddy and them went out there and demonstrated in protest, they knew they were going to be arrested.
Right.
So they weren't even trying to resist arrest. The whole purpose was to not just protest, but to be willing to put my very body on the line for this issue. So if it means that I have to go to jail, I go in that jail with dignity and with the strength of, everything in me. And so even in that, sometimes sometimes we're looking like, why are they arresting me? Why are they doing this? Even if I'm peacefully protesting, even if they're, have stepped over the line, you still have to stay in that posture because the greater goal is what you are focused on.
The greater goal and dramatizing the issue.
Exactly.
The nonviolent direct action, in the words of your father, makes it clear who's the oppressed and who's the oppressor. So it should dramatize. That's why when they were at the lunch counters in Birmingham and Nashville and other cities, the stores in Nashville, they didn't respond when people spat on them because their goal was to get legislation passed. So if the goal is to push us towards a ceasefire, what's the posture that we have to have for that, and to keep the attention on that goal in a humane way, Dr. King, that simply says we don't want any more people to die. That's not even about being against things initially. That's just we want no more loss of life in this situation. And we want that in Gaza, we want that in Congo, we want that in Sudan. We want militarism, one of the Kingian triple evils, when it's paired with poverty and racism, to be seriously addressed across the globe. Your parents believe that the way to do that, we've been talking about this often, was to make nonviolence a course of serious study and experimentation, so we can do that right individually and collectively in our governments.
This battle difficult, and so that's why what we do is so important, because we got to raise up a new generation of people who think totally different about all of this, who understands that violence is just violence, not just physical violence, but violence of speech, violence of thought is not the way. We're not getting, the results we keep getting is more violence. As we say all the time, and Daddy said, it's a descending spiral, and we're seeing it.
It's a descending spiral, and it's going to take building our will and our thinking. Even as you were saying that, someone was commenting about the threat of Hamas in Gaza, and the things that could potentially happen to Jewish people, to Israeli people. And we're in no way saying that we don't believe there should be a pathway of peace that prevents harm to everybody.
Exactly.
We believe that's possible. But I think it's also understanding that that's hard because we're so inundated with violence and with the notion that peace is not possible, that what I'm seeing, Dr. King, is it's hard for people to believe that peace is possible. So the automatic response is somebody got to die. So we're saying Palestinian children are dying. Well, they're just casualties. Well, our children can't be casualties. Other human beings just can't be casualties. Well, somebody has to pay for this. Well, we can find a way to peace. But when you say that, the immediate response is no. And I think it's our conditioning, that we've been conditioned by the violence that we continually take in, and by the rhetoric of our times, to believe that peace isn't possible. And I think it's important that we continue to lift the idea, the fact that we can get to peace if we want it.
And exactly, and we're going to continue to do that. That peace is possible. I'm not giving up. I'm not going to allow anybody to bring me down to the level to engage in tit for tat and violence for violence and destruction for destruction. I was listening to a senator this morning. I can't remember what show it was. And Senator Murphy, I think from Connecticut, and he said something I think is so important. He said, I think it's important that we wind down what's happening in Israel. And he said we've got to find an alternative to address Hamas. He said, because the reality is, in the world we live in, terrorists are going to be there. They'll move to another territory, We have to build up a different kind of spirit and heart. And he said, if you begin to create, a space and place, where there can be, and this is when he started talking about the two-nation solution, you lessen the number of those who join in with Hamas and things of that nature. And I thought it was important, coming from the mouth of a senator, to say that. He said, because the violence is not going to stop. So I'm saying you, quote unquote, let's just deal with this. Quote unquote, I root them out of Israel or Gaza. Well, they go over to some other nation. Are their people not important as well? So we've got to find another way, because we keep trying to think we can, like, cancel culture. I can get rid of. I can just move aside. There's no such thing as winning violence with violence. There's no winners. That stuff continues to grow. It continues to recruit. So we have to lessen the demand. I mean, the supply. By creating dignified environments, by creating nations where people feel like they can thrive and live and have freedom and justice and equality. Because when you don't have those things present, it breeds these kinds of
breeds. And it's getting to the root issues too, Dr. King, understanding what the root issues are with this violence that we see around the world. But one of the things we know too is when a people group has been the victim of a grave atrocity, self-protection becomes a concern. And when I talk to my Jewish neighbors, that's one of the things I've talked to them about, that I've been to the Holocaust Museum and been devastated. I find it unbelievable. And I know one of the things I have to think about as a Black woman, Black human being, is how do I not want what happened to my group to happen to another group? Because there can be, for me, sometimes a concern about myself, looking at the people who perpetuated the harm against my ancestors and against my aunts and uncles and against Black people today, and thinking we need to retaliate, we need to prevent that from happening. And the prevention can look like violence. The prevention can look like harming that group to prevent that harm from happening to us. And then I start to group some of the people with everybody. And so instead of it just being the people who actually did it and are still doing it, everybody gets grouped together. And then suddenly, all Palestinian people, in the case of some folks that I've talked to, are a danger to our Jewish neighbors, which is not true. And so there's also, I think, we're looking at the harm of violence and atrocity across decades, that we have to dig in and talk to each other and say, how can we get rid of atrocity and prevent atrocity without perpetuating atrocity against another group? So how can we prevent Holocaust without perpetuating Holocaust against another group of people? That's real. And I don't think we talk about that enough and lift that even in our protests.
Yeah, I definitely agree.
Yeah.
So this has been a good discussion, because one thing about the right to protest, it's the right to protest in public spaces. It's different on private property.
Right.
And some of these universities, some of them are public universities, but some of them are not. Emory is a private campus. Making a provision for a space and place for them for students, because students are going to do that. I mean, they are the essence and the core of every movement that we have seen in this world. And so be thoughtful, because it could be at your campus next. Be proactive, create forums and opportunities to hear these hear these young people and the concerns, and see what your campus and community can do, because I don't think any one of us want to see this continue to be perpetuated. I don't think. Yes, we want the hostages released, but it can't be a either or. It's all hostages released, permanent ceasefire. Violence never solves violence. All I know is there's going to always be this element of evil in our universe. And so we have to be able to build up good to a place that it's minimized, that it's neutralized. And we have to be thoughtful and strategic about that, because it's always going to be a factor in every generation. And we don't have to succumb to it, and we don't have to let that energy pull us into its energy field, so that we become brutal, like that force is brutal. And so let's all collectively think about in our own spaces and places how we can put enough energy together to move us past this horrific time period that we're in, that so many lives are being taken from us. That it is not necessary to address the issues that we are seeking to address. So it's a lot of work to do, a lot of soul searching to do, a lot of studying to do. And we're here because I'm going to always encourage. I don't care what anybody says. I don't care if anybody disagrees, because, I'm going to still believe what I believe. I'm going to still advocate for what I advocate for in terms of Kingian nonviolence. I believe my father was a gift to this world. I'm not saying he was the only gift, but I believe he was a gift to this world. And what he showed us and demonstrated for us is so critical for us to study it. That's why this year during the King holiday, and this year our theme has been shifting the cultural climate. And we put it out there in the atmosphere early through the study and practice of Kingian nonviolence. We got to study it, and then we got to practice it. We got to put it into play, but we got to study it. We got to understand it. And there's a place to study it.
Nonviolence is the answer to the crucial political and moral questions of our time.
Nonviolence 365 is a powerful, practical approach to dealing with conflict and dismantling injustice. Whether it's in your personal life, in your school or workplace, your local community, or a national movement.